Hey everybody, so in this video I'm going to do a very quick walkthrough of my cook of some delicious beef ribs, a prime brisket, and also share my experience of holding those cooks in an oven for over 12 hours. Here we go. Hey everyone, my name is Kevin Hu, and thank you for stopping by the Who's Smoking channel. First off, as of the recording of this video, I am a little over 400 subscribers, which is just a few shy of 1 million, which is my dream and my goal. But anyways, again, huge thank you to all of you who have subscribed and liked the videos and have been sharing encouragement throughout this journey for me. But at some point, if you are enjoying the content and you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel. Share some love, and if you're getting something out of this video too, don't forget to like it as well. All right, now on to the main content of this video. I've actually put a few timestamps in the description, so if you want to skip through kind of the preparation and the cooking process and get straight into the nitty-gritty about the oven fiasco that I got into, go ahead and click on that particular link and it'll take you right there. So the other day I picked up some beef ribs, some plate ribs from Costco. And for those of you who aren't totally familiar, at least for us here in the Bay Area, I can find almost everywhere beef back ribs, and so those are the very kind of like lean, thinned out ribs that you get, but very few places actually sell the plate ribs, which is like the short ribs that we eat when you go to Korean barbecue, the galbi or things like that. But instead of getting them thinly sliced, you get these huge, massive dino bones, and they usually come in threes. So I was at the Costco looking for some brisket the other day, and I found the plate ribs, and it had 2 of them in one pack. And so I picked that up, and I picked up a prime brisket, brought it home, and I just knew I was gonna cook it the same way, so I just wanted to throw everything on there at the same time and just see what happened. Okay, so looking at these beef ribs right here, basically just open them up. I kept the membranes on there just because different sources that I've been reading and the ways I've seen them cooked, most folks seem to keep on the membranes just to keep it all together. And so I kept those on. I did trim off some of the thick hard fat on the top of the ribs. And then from there, it was just basic mustard binder. And I went 2 to 1. I went to town. I went 2 to 1 on the pepper to salt ratio. And I don't know about y'all, but for the longest time, anytime I've done salt and pepper, it's always been something close to 50-50. I'm not sure where I kind of got that from. I picked it up early on and I just stuck with it. But I noticed coming out of the the last brisket I tried, which was a Snow's brisket, it was so peppery and so good. And since then, I've seen different people cooking with the 2 to 1 ratio with so much more pepper. And in fact, I think it was the Chud's Barbecue channel or whatnot, but they pretty much just like doused the entire thing with all of this rub and then just shook off the excess, which is just way more rub than I normally use. But again, if you go 2 to 1, you don't have to worry about over salting the meat because the pepper is going to cover so much more of that surface area. So anyhow, I went 2 to 1. So on these ribs, that's all I did. A little bit of mustard and went 2 to 1, put them to the side, and then we have our brisket. The brisket, I did a little bit more of an aggressive trim than I normally do. It might not be like proper aggressive by like pitmaster standards, but for me, it was a little bit more aggressive. And I've been more okay doing that lately because I know that those trims are not gonna go to waste. Those trimmings, in fact, went to some smash burgers that I made later on. So really stoked about being able to do that now that I have a meat grinder and all that. So anyhow, similar kind of process. I trimmed everything up, and then I went with the mustard binder, and then again, went to town 2 to 1 with the pepper to salt ratio on that rub, and caked that whole thing up and let them sit for about an hour while the fire was going in the smoker. Now, in addition to doing this a little bit differently with the rub, going to that 2 to 1 ratio, the other thing I did differently on the brisket is instead of doing my traditional butcher paper wrap after the bark sets, I wanted to try the foil boat method. And I tried it once before to a pretty massive fail. I think I didn't wrap it up tight enough, and all the juices that were supposed to hold in that boat to help moisten up that lean ended up just dripping all out. And so I wanted to try it again on this particular cook. And so about 4 to 6 hours in, you could definitely see how the bark was setting on both pieces of meat, nothing abnormal. But then around the 6 to 8 hour mark, now you see this darkening of the bark, especially on that brisket, and it was just looking really, really good. That pepper and salt rub on top definitely helps to darken that bark a lot more. And so I let them cook up. So the beef ribs went to, I think, 175 or 185 internal temp before I actually wrapped them in butcher paper. Didn't add any tallow, just did some basic apple cider vinegar water mixture, just kind of saturated the paper a little bit, wrapped them up, threw them back in the smoker until they came up to 205, 206, I think. And then on the brisket, I pulled it, I think, at around 180 degrees, and I took 2 pieces of foil. This time I tried to make sure they were, perfectly flat, and then just curled up the edges around this particular brisket, threw it back in, and I did come back, I think, every 45 minutes or so, just to spritz the top of it. And I just loved the way the bark was setting on this thing. It was beautiful. So at the rate that I was cooking, I knew that everything would be done around midnight. And so I needed to find a way to be able to hold both pieces of meat well into the next day so I could serve it for a late lunch. Now, in holding for 4 to 6 hours, usually I have no problem using a cooler that we have. You throw in some towels in there. Sometimes I heat up the towel, or sometimes I'll put some hot water in the cooler. And for the most part, that has allowed me to get about 4 to 6 solid hours before the meat drops below 150 degrees. In this case, I needed to hold it for at least 12 hours. And so I wanted to see what I could do in the oven. Now, I've always kind of shied away from holding foods in the oven for a couple of reasons. One, our oven doesn't go below 170, which seems to be kind of the standard all the way around. And also, I know for a fact that our particular oven swings in temperature, like pretty badly. I had one of our meat probes, or ambient probes in there one time just to measure it out, and I think at 170, it was swinging anywhere from like 160 up to 210. And so I was like, gosh, that's not gonna work if I wanna hold something in there. It's gonna be cooking it. But then, again, as I am trolling different videos and looking at different forums, there are a lot of folks who have had success holding their barbecue in their ovens at 170 for extended periods of time, and they claim that it's still incredibly good. And so I wanted to try that. Now, quick kind of like hack, I don't know if y'all know this, but most of these residential ovens allow you to calibrate the temperature, meaning if you are checking the temperature inside of the oven and you're looking at the thermostat and they're actually different, you can actually go into the settings menu and adjust that kind of trim up into, I think, plus or minus 35 degrees. And so on our Frigidaire, it allows you actually to bring it down or up 35 degrees. So at 170, I went ahead and just adjusted this thing down so that the swings dropped closer to about 150 degrees on the low, and it still peaked out, unfortunately, at 190, but it was a much more usable average than the 10-15 degrees it was before. So I don't know what kind of oven you got. I didn't know if you knew this hack. I just found out about it recently, but give it a shot if you are in a bind and you need something to hold your barbecue for an extended period of time. So with all that said, I want to show you the data really quickly. I took a screenshot of this thing. So I used the Thermoworks Signals unit to help me not only measure the temps of the meat and the oven temperature, but also so that it could actually record to their cloud service. So I can go back and actually look through the whole 12-hour period and see where the temperature swings were at. And as you can see, this oven was flying from 150 up to 195 and up and down, up and down, up and down. But you can see that the resting temp of the meat continues to drop very slowly. And by the 12-hour mark, it was close to about 159 to 161 degrees for both pieces of meat. Actually, so I had 2 beef ribs and I had 1 brisket. So all of them kind of averaged down to about 159, 160, which I thought was pretty impressive. I didn't go through and spritz it all overnight. I just straight up went to sleep. And so the next day I checked on them a little bit. The bark looked amazing. Color was great. The smell in our house was ridiculously good. So when I pulled everything out, everything smelled great, everything looked great. I started with the brisket first. Upon my first cut, the first thing I noticed was, man, that bark is so good. I think that's, I was shocked by how good that bark was. It was sensational. I was cutting through it. I was like, the 2-to-1 rub, the extended kind of cooking time with that foil boat and resting it overnight, it just created such a beautiful bark. I was cutting through that, smoke ring is there, it looked super tender, and lo and behold, it was too tender. When I got to the middle of the brisket, I tried to do a bend test, and as you can see, it fails the bend test and it fails the pull test. So it was definitely overcooked. Now, because I was sitting there and I was able to try everything right on the spot, it was, yeah, I'm gonna tell you, it was still really dang good. Like, tender, yes, but the flavor, the smokiness, all of that was so good, but I definitely brought that up a little too much. Looking back, what I probably would have done is actually not have taken that brisket as high as I did, and just so it could spend more time breaking down in the hold in the oven versus cooking it up to, I think it was like, I think probe tender was like 205, 206 on this brisket. So I probably would have pulled it 5 degrees sooner, knowing that I was gonna hold it for this long. So anyhow, brisket though, it still tasted really good, but just a little pot roasty. Okay, so now moving on to the beef ribs. Again, bark was phenomenal. So if you notice again on the beef ribs, I did wrap those overnight, whereas the brisket I left in that foil boat. So I unwrapped everything, bark looked amazing, cut right through it. I've only done beef ribs like these twice. The first time it was not quite cooked high enough, and I've been reading that you want to take beef ribs a few degrees over what you would take brisket because there's so much more fat in them and they can break down a lot more. And so I did that, and whoo, those beef ribs were so dang good. The meat was incredibly tender, smoky, that bark was there, and the bones pulled out smoothly. Like, that was a really, really tasty and heavy meal. Yeah, so I invited my buddy over. We all kind of shared some blades. My wife Becca was there, and so we all had some coleslaw and just some ribs and some brisket. Everything was really good, but again, by the end of it, my observations were simply the brisket was a little dry. I felt like the beef ribs were pretty much spot on, although next time I think if I am going to do a hold this long for 12 hours, I'll probably open it up and then spritz it all over again just to get the outer bark a little bit more moist before I wrap it all up and hold it for that long. And I'll definitely need to do some more experimenting with how to adjust the cook times initially in preparation for extended holding times, if that makes sense. So closing thoughts on using the oven as a holder, I think it's actually pretty cool. I haven't actually change the calibration back to what it was before, but I think I just might keep it as it is. Now that I know that my oven can hold a certain temperature on average over 12 hours and that it could work, I see myself using that more in the future. Everything I've been reading, all the feedback that people have been giving me on this channel and the comments is that, gosh, Kev, you can't just focus on the cook time. You also have to make sure you budget in a very healthy holding time. And a lot of the things I've been reading is, 2 to 4 hours minimum. But if you can, push it to 8, 10, or even 12 hours. And judging just by the results of this particular cook, I would say yes, definitely. I plan on budgeting 8 to 10 hours at least for all of the cooks in the future, and the oven is a good way to go. So with that said though, one thing that I would caution you, if this is the first time you're doing it, is that make sure that you are prepared to adjust a little bit on your front end, on your cooking time, knowing how long your hold time is going to be. And again, just maybe learning from my mistake here, I don't think that the right move was to cook all the way up until the end to that 205, 206, and then throw it into a hold for 12 hours. I just feel like that hold time, especially since the temperature was, on average 160, 165, that breaks down the meat even more. So in this case, for my brisket, instead of pulling it at the 203, 204 mark, whatever it was, I would probably have just pulled it right at 200 and just to experiment with that. But again, I won't know. Hopefully I'll make another video and give you guys some updates on it. All right, everyone, so those are kind of my experiences over the last 48 hours. Hopefully you got something out of it. I would also love to know if you've been holding your barbecue for 10 plus hours at a time, how are you doing it? Are you using your oven? Are you using some other DIY hack that I'm not aware of? Feel free to please share those in the comments so other people can see it and so that I can also interact with you there as well. And as always, if you liked the video, if you enjoyed it, please hit like. Don't forget to subscribe and support the channel if you can. And until next time, who's smoking?